It was called the Forgotten War, a war that never officially ended and whose impact still shapes our world today. It is a war that the United States held some responsibility for starting, and a war that the U.S. needs to resolve. The Korean War affected millions of people's rights, including the right to safety, life, and freedom. Rights are important, but they come with responsibilities for both people and governments involved. The Korean War is an example of when totalitarianism tries to take over a part of the world, but this time it was called communism. To start, the Korean War was an act of aggression by North Korea against South Korea. The United Nations recognized the aggression and authorized a UN police action to try and defend the South's sovereignty. Under the UN Charter, the member nations had a responsibility to respect international humanitarian law and human rights during the conflict, even in a time of war, including protecting civilians and limiting the means and methods of warfare to reduce suffering. The action of the UN to declare police action had a domino effect because UN members, including the United States, had responsibility to uphold international law. Using this responsibility, the United States acted to try and stop the spread of communism in the region. In this short video, you will learn some key dates, how the war started, why the United States got involved, some of the effects of people involved, and the conflict and lasting results of the war. Post-World War II, North and South Korea were divided along the 38th parallel as an agreement between the United States and Soviet Union. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine was established as the U.S. foreign policy. This policy pledged American support for democratic nations, resisting communist aggression or subversion, and marked the beginning of the Cold War. Tension from this policy, as well as the idea that communism needs to be spread, as proposed by North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, built up until June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops invaded South Korea. As already stated, the United Nations recognized the aggression and authorized a UN police action to try and defend the South's sovereignty. Since the United States was a member nation and held the Truman Doctrine as policy, President Truman led the U.S. and UN forces to send troops to South Korea to repel the North Korean invasion. The build-up to war started as early as January 17, 1950, when Kim Il-sung proposed the liberation of South Korea to Soviet officials, ultimately getting assurance of support for the invasion from the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and Chinese leader Mao Zedong. On June 25, 1950, 100,000 North Korean troops poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea. They reached their farthest point south on September 12, 1950, when the South Korean army only controlled about 5,000 square miles in and around Prussia. The North Korean army suffering from heavy losses and supply chain issues. U.S. Major General Edward M. Almond stages an audacious amphibious landing on Incheon on October 25, 1950. But the Chinese assigned two entire armies to try and drive the U.S. Marines out of Korea. The armies fail and suffer the loss of 80,000 troops. This period in the conflict is named the Frozen Chosen and becomes one of the most storied episodes in the U.S. Marine Corps history. One of the most famous events of the Korean War is when President Truman relived General MacArthur of command. General MacArthur was famous for his return and liberation of the Philippines in World War II. U.S. and South Korean troops drove the North Korean troops back, but the war reached the stalemate until July 27, 1952, when Mark W. Clark for the UN command, Peng Dehuai for the Chinese, and Kim Il-sung for North Korea concluded an armistice ending hostilities. From that agreement, the demilitarized zone was created along the 38th parallel and remains in that state until today. The Korean War shows the neglect of civilian need and objectification of individuals, resulting in significant human rights violations and lasting consequences. Destruction of infrastructure and division of families show how responsibilities that both Korean governments and international actors had towards their citizens. South Korea's commitment to rebuilding demonstrates and dedication to human rights, contrasting with North Korea's oppressive regime, which continues to deny its citizens awareness and support. The war had dramatic effect on South Korea, from the destruction of homes and buildings during the conflict to the culture that has developed around the U.S. bases that still exist today. My argument is that when the U.S. adopted the Truman Doctrine as its foreign policy, it set the stages for conflict in Korea. While the policy was a reaction to the aggression from the Soviet Union that dated back to World War II, and the aftermath, it was one more event that had added to the tension in the region. Under the UN Charter, the member nations had responsibility to respect international humanitarian law and human rights during conflict, even in a time of war, including protecting civilians and limiting the means and methods of warfare to reduce suffering. The action of the UN to declare a police action had a domino effect. Just like the treaties and alliances of World War I, UN members were allied together and thus had responsibility to uphold international law. Once the U.S. landed on the beaches of Korea, the responsibility to rebuild the country and maintain peace was signed in blood. Blood of the civilians who died, for the service members who lost their limbs and lives fighting in the war. For example, since the war was declared a police action and there was no declaration of war made by the U.S., returning U.S. troops could not receive VA hospital benefits. It took an act of Congress to change the law and give the U.S. troops the care they needed. The act of not having a declaration of war is what has led the Korean War being called the Forgotten War. Around U.S. bases to this day, human trafficking of women as prostitutes is allowed to continue by both the U.S. government and South Korean government. These are responsibilities that had to be handled and still be resolved, and are strong reasons why hostilities need to come to a true end. The Korean War is still impacting world policies. The North Korean people continue to live under a dictator with no human rights, in poverty, and with the knowledge of advancements in the rest of the world enjoys. This is evidence from space. When you look at North Korea at night, there are no lights. The thought of how people have to live in constant fear and escape like Yeomi Park did is a true act of bravery. Kim Jong-un continues to threaten the world with development of nuclear weapons. It is destabilizing to the area because the countries around North Korea are now actively building up their armies, like Japan. This way of thinking just prolongs the stalemate, which prolongs the need for the U.S. to continue having troops and bases in the area. This keeps families apart, enabling the continuing of human trafficking, and leaves the U.S. with no good options to resolve the conflict and absolve the U.S. responsibility.